Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, a discursive programme aimed at tackling social taboo topics in the Middle East. Today our focus is on the culture of drugs in the Middle East. Proof in terms of treatment demand, social expression, related crime, HIV and hepatitis C increasing in the region indirectly indicate that drug consumption is on the rise, and it's the youth that are being hit the hardest. With this in mind, we'll be looking at the reasons why levels of addiction are growing among the youth in particular, the consequences of this surge, and exploring various prevention, education and rehabilitation methods. At this point, I'd like to welcome my studio guests, Claire Vainola. Claire works as a therapist at the Promise Rehabilitation Clinic here in the UK and has previously worked as a senior therapist in Lebanon, introducing the 12-step recovery and addiction treatment in the Middle East. Also with me again is Dr. Rebwa Fatah, Middle East expert and director of the Middle East Consultancy Services in the UK. Welcome and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But before we move on, let's take a look at this brief report.
Hashish, cannabis, cat or cocaine. The rise of drugs has become an unavoidable topic throughout the Middle East. While substances like ecstasy, cocaine and MDMA have mostly made their way from the West into the region, the Middle East is no stranger to producing and using narcotics. According to the 2007 World Drug Report, the production and distribution of illicit drugs, particularly cannabis, continues to be a worrying trend in the Middle East and North Africa, and increasing drug abuse has accompanied this trend. During Lebanon's civil war, cannabis cultivation was a major source of income in the Bekaa Valley, where most of the country's hashish and opium were produced. A multi-billion-dollar industry fueling the agricultural sector as well as political factions and organized crime. In 2012, it was reported that a kilo of cannabis could fetch up to $1,700, making it one of the most lucrative crop business. Egypt is one of Africa's top cultivators of cannabis and opium poppies, with the number of hectares discovered that are dedicated to growing addictive substances increasing steadily over the last decade. It is estimated that addicts in Egypt are spending $2.9 billion on drugs each year. Estimates on how many people are addicted to opiates, cannabis, amphetamine-type stimulants or heroin vary greatly, but range between 600,000 and 800,000 according to a 2007 study. The slums of Cairo and Giza are hotbeds for addiction, with street children being the most vulnerable victims. Street children living in these areas find oblivion through the use of glue sniffing, cannabis or prescription drug abuse. For those with more income, cocaine, heroin and ecstasy are regularly abused. And that isn't the case just in Egypt. Many countries in the region are seeing an alarming rise in under-18s consuming and abusing drugs, with very little help available to tackle the problem.
Dr. Fatah, the Middle East is no stranger to producing and using narcotics. But it's on the rise. Are you surprised?
Not at all. I think there are many things that are related to each other. Among them, of course, crimes, security vacuum, and also drugs. And you can also count drugs as crimes. Now, after the Arab Spring, we see many countries with a huge security vacuum. For example, Iraq, Syria, and also Egypt. And of course, with all these insurgent groups operating freely and having their own safe haven in the area, you do expect drugs to be on the rise.
Yes.
First of all, for use or themselves, because the stress. Yeah. Like the soldiers in Syria, they use drugs in order to ease out their stress, and the great stress. And also, there are many reports in the objective evidence stating that they use it to buy weapons and arms.
Okay, so it's no surprise. Claire, can we just talk a little bit about addiction before we launch into the big debate? What's the difference between an addictive user and a casual user who uses it on a night out occasionally? Where do you draw that line?
There's a huge difference, and thank you for raising the point, because this is one of the challenges I faced in the Middle East, is that addiction, when we use the word addiction, we're talking about a brain disease. We're talking about a total lack of control, where there's been changes in the reward pathways in the brain. So the person is not using because they want to, they're using to feel normal. So it's not a question of morality. Well, I think people often say, Look at the consequences. This person's getting legal consequences, they're losing their money, their family, their health. Why aren't they stopping? It's simply because the brain has become rewired and they don't have the tools to stop. And the first thing we've got to do is provide detox to put the fire out.
So they want to forget about the hardship of their life?
It's actually more complex than that.
Of course.
People may start off as recreational users. Why do young people use? They want to feel good. And certainly what Dr. Fatah said, if we look at war-torn areas, people are going to have higher states of anxiety, so they're going to want something to relax, to feel calm.
Yeah,
the problem is, if they have what we now know in neuroscience, a genetic predisposition, that means there's a dysregulation in the brain, and the brain actually craves more drugs than they can't stop. There is a huge difference, though, between someone who's using it recreationally or even abusing compared to being an addict. And that's about the neuroscience, that's about the physical factor.
Okay. Well, you've worked in Lebanon. How was drug taking viewed by society? Or if someone fell into an addiction, how was that viewed?
It was viewed as a huge shame. It was used that mudmins, mudminas were bad people, that they should be imprisoned. Indeed, I met people who were actually locked up in mental health institutions in mixed wards whose families had put them away because they had addictions and they didn't know what else to do with them.
So lock them up?
Yeah, lock
out
them
of
up.
Sight.
Very Dickensian, like we would have done in this country many years ago. And the thing is, it wasn't seen that these people have an illness. If someone has cancer, we don't think, hey, we're going to lock you up. We're going to get you the treatment. And this went on. For me, it wasn't just about drugs, but around other issues in the society too. It's very closed, and freedom of sort of speech, of talking about these issues, is very much frowned upon.
Dr. Fatah, what are the most common drugs at the moment among the youth in the Middle East?
I think all sorts are used, from like a liquid which treats your sore throat to very heavy painkillers such as Dramatol, and then it goes through all the other drugs that we are familiar with. And I would like to add to Lebanese case. And Lebanon is probably one of the most liberal countries in the Middle East.
Yes,
if you move to other countries such as Iraq, Iran, or Saudi Arabia, or Jordan, or Kuwait, or United Arab Emirates, you will see more conservative culture towards drug users and so on. Because I think that there are a number of problems. I mean, first of all, it's not treated like as a disease as such. I say this is, just people are evil. And the other problem is people are not educated enough to believe in rehabilitation. They say, well, I'm not going to be rehabilitated. I'm not mad. Because, if you are, you have to lose your mind, in order to use drugs. So there are many taboos around drugs and drug users. And most of the time, the families keep them in-house and give them the drugs in order not to shame the family.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now joining us over Skype from Cairo is Hugh Miles, journalist and Middle East consultant. Hugh, in your novel, Playing Cards in Cairo, you depict a character called Yosra with an addiction to prescription drugs. Why did you choose to portray this theme in the novel?
Well, it's a true story. It's a true representation of a person. Because prescription drugs are very widespread in Egypt. It's something that people abuse very commonly, and often it's not seen as a real problem. It's just seen as people self-medicating in the way that maybe you might take an aspirin if you've got a headache.
Okay, so a very common problem in Egyptian life, among the youth in particular, or across every generation?
I think it's across all boundaries. My experience is that it goes from drugs are something which everyone in society indulges in from top to bottom. It's men and women of all social backgrounds. So you can find all kinds of people using and abusing drugs, of course.
And Claire, this character is obviously female. Is it more common, in your opinion, amongst women? Hugh seems to think not, but...
I would tend to agree with him, and I think, as well as my work in Lebanon, I have a lot of international clients here in London, and why young people, particularly in the Middle East, are using prescription drugs like benzodiazepines, the tramadols, and so forth, is their parents can't detect them as easily. And I think that also they're very easily available. And in fact, they're not aware of the harm caused to the brain by these drugs.
Hugh, drugs among street children are rife in Egypt. How do they even get these drugs?
Well, I mean, as we all know, drug addicts can always find drugs, and they will do anything for drugs, even if it means selling themselves or crime, or, you know, there are no limits. Drugs come first, don't they, if you're a drug addict, before food, before clean water, before proper medical care or accommodation. You know, everything you've got goes into your drugs. So, you know, when you have that kind of devotion or motivation, then people find the resources, even if they're street children. Of course, they're not very expensive. It's very easy to get prescription drugs over the counter, certainly in Egypt, and I think in many Arab countries. The pharmacist will give you drugs that you would not normally get in the West at a very low price. I mean, tramadol was mentioned earlier. There's a bunch of prescription drugs that are very, very easy to get and are very powerful, psychoactive and addictive chemicals.
I mean, do you think the Egyptian authorities are in denial about there being a drug problem amongst the youth?
Well, I think the Egyptian authorities have got a lot on their plate anyway. They've got a enormous number of social and economic problems, and drugs, although they're certainly a problem, they're not anywhere near the number one problem. So the government is overstretched, and yes, they could and should be doing more to combat drugs, but the fact is they don't have the resources.
But why is there more talk about clamping down on, say, alcohol as opposed to tramadol being acquired on the black market?
Well, I mean, I think there is a cultural and religious sort of background to this, which makes drug use and abuse in the Middle East slightly different in some respects from in the West. And I mean, obviously one of the features is that the Arab world is mainly Muslim, and alcohol is prohibited in the Quran, but the Quran is less clear about other kinds of drugs. And so many Muslims and indeed non-Muslims interpret this as a kind of green light, and so they believe that alcohol should be avoided, but drugs, they can sort of fudge the issue. So I think this is perhaps one reason why drugs are available, but it's also are popular. But it's also the availability. Of course, there's not many bars and serving alcohol and pubs. It's not part of culture in the Middle East region, but pharmacies are everywhere. And there's a great deal of acceptability with the idea that you can self-medicate. It's very common for people to self-medicate in a normal way, so to speak, not in an abusive way. It is quite normal for people to take more drugs and to help themselves, to prescribe themselves things. And I think this happens much more in the Middle East than it would do, for example, in the UK, where people just decide that they are depressed and they're going to seek out some antidepressants and they're going to give themselves a course, and if they don't like it, they'll switch to something else and try a cocktail of different drugs, and this all happens in a way, and it's related too to the level of education and the understanding about health, which is also a big problem in Egypt. The level of education is very low, levels of literacy are very, relatively speaking, low. So this obviously increases the risk factor for people who don't understand what they're doing.
Okay, Hugh, I'm just going to bring in Claire to comment on that. I think you were nodding your head.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that Hugh said. I think that because obviously if you are Muslim, alcohol is haram, therefore there's this part of the denial mechanism in addiction is that, oh, well, it's not so bad to use these drugs, when in fact it actually is. And the other point that Hugh raised I'd like to come in on was about, you know, addicts doing anything to get their drug of choice. And for me, that's simply about that, because the phenomenon of physical craving and the preoccupation, because there's no treatment, what we do in addiction treatment is actually alleviate the preoccupation to use. And if these tools aren't provided to people, how on earth can they stop?
Dr. Fatah, did you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
I think I got quite fascinated by what you said. I mean, there are, of course, apart from that, alcohol is, you know, is forbidden and is haram in Quran. But there are other countries where alcohol is forbidden, like in Iran. So what happens? People is easier to use drugs, because if you catch you with a bottle of beer, the punishment could be like 80 lashes publicly. And then I'm just giving as an example. But if they, you know, arrest you with a couple of tablets, they don't know what it is. So it's easier to transport, easier to get, and it's for the children, because the parents, I mean, children are a very interesting subject of the Middle East, because the parents wouldn't allow the children to have alcohol, and they can smell it, they can see it at home. So what the kids do, take, I don't know, a couple of aspirins or whatever they find in the house, and then they go high. But there's no evidence against them that they have been drinking alcohol. And that's also a problem. And of course, education is vital. As you mentioned, the level of education is really very, very low. And that goes across the whole spectrum, whether it's sex education, whether it's like drug education, whether it's anything else. These things are taboo. You shouldn't talk about it.
Hugh, the Arab Spring was supposed to provide a hopeful future for the youth. I mean, yet more have slipped into drug addiction. What's gone wrong?
Well, I mean, the problem is that the problems are so deep-rooted. You know, there's been many decades of neglect, and the fabric of society in the Middle East has been rotting and falling apart for many years. The biggest Arab countries, which should be leading the Arab world, have been failing in their duty for a long time. They have been giving their young people no good options. There's no jobs. There's no future for many people. And there's no freedoms, or very limited freedoms, political freedoms, very limited freedom of association, expression. So it's a very hopeless situation. And so, you know, young people are attracted to anything to escape this. And of course, many of them try and go to Europe on leaky boats, and many of them go and join extreme terrorist organisations like Daesh, because they feel this is going to make a difference. But most of them just stay at home and just, you know, live with the daily grind and with no future. And so drugs are very seductive and appealing, because of course they provide the illusion of an escape and a better quality of life. So they're a shortcut for many people looking for a better life, and instead they just slide into more problems with drug addiction.
So an escape for a lost generation?
Well, it's a lost society. It's a whole society, you know, which is going down the drain, frankly. I mean, you look at the Middle East today, and you look at all the wars and conflict and problems. I mean, I think if you were a young person growing up in the Arab world, then, you know, your choice is pretty stark. You either leave on a raft, you know, you can go and join a death cult, or you can stay and just face the misery. And if you're going to face the misery, people would prefer to self-medicate.
Well, Hugh Miles, thank you so much for joining us on today's programme.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Claire, can we generalise when we talk about the youth? I mean, are there differences between the youths in the West and the youths in the Middle East and their approach to drug taking and addictions?
I think that all human beings are as unique as our fingerprints. I believe in diversity. And I think when I was listening to Hugh there, what I would say is that young people are using to control the way they feel, because they can't control anything else that's happening externally. It's not about escaping. It's about controlling the emotions. So I don't have to sit with my anxiety, my anger, my sadness, my grief, like the young men who are using tramadol in Palestine. You know, it's a way of them to change the way that they feel.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Fatah, what about educated youths from affluent families? Why are they also going into drugs?
Because they don't really have much freedom. I mean, I think freedom you mentioned is vital, especially for the younger generations. And, you know, with all these media opening the world, you know, in front of them, and they see this, you know, you can see how people live in the Western world, and they can't do much. They can, if you live in Iran, you can go to a bar, you can go to a nightclub, you cannot go to anywhere which is designed for young people. What do? You join a couple of friends and take drugs, and in that way, with a bit of luck, you forget about the world you are. You go underground, and slowly you build on that, and that is, I believe, that's a major problem. And there's also not freedom of movement. For example, if an Iranian young person wants to visit the West, it's very, very difficult for him unless he has a lot of contacts, he has a lot of money. So that freedom, like if my daughters want to go to France, they don't even need a visa. They can decide now and get on the Eurostar. You know, to travel to a different country in the Middle East is very, very expensive. So all these doors are closed on you. So what do you do? I mean, I guess, as you mentioned, you either join Islamic State and go on a suicide mission, and then you start drugs anyway.
And Claire, how would they get treatment or seek help?
Well, for me is we've spent a lot of time discussing the problem, so we do need to discuss what the solution is.
And we will,
And
in more detail, but yeah.
And the good news is I do believe that there's hope, is that in Iran there's been much encouragement by the government, I believe, of 12-step recovery meetings, which is where one addict who's in recovery helps another addict. And that is a free source of treatment for people who do not have the funds to come here to the UK for treatment. So there is a solution, and I believe that's based in abstinence-based recovery.
And Claire, is there a correlation between a youth's upbringing and the likeliness to fall into addiction?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that developmental issues in addiction need to be considered. If we think about people are attaching to a chemical rather than relationally, so they end up living in their own head, okay? And so where they're getting their self-soothing from is this chemical. I think that the genetic predisposition, I think there may be issues of trauma, certainly, and it's their way of self-medicating, which was said before. However, once the addiction kicks in, when the organic changes have occurred, the person's using to feel normal because the dopamine levels in the brain have changed.
But the family unit, doesn't it have to, if it's a broken household? Yes,
I think that we often say that addiction is a family disease.
Right.
So if we look at the family system as a whole, Dr. Fatah already mentioned that family members enable the addict to continue using. So oftentimes we do need to treat the whole family, which is really important.
Okay. Well, now over Skype from Paris is Roya Kashefi, head of the Human Rights Committee at the Association des Chercheurs Iraniens. Roya, with a focus on Iran, what concerns you most about what is happening when it comes to youth and their involvement in the narcotics industry?
One of the main problems that we have is that we don't have any idea about the numbers and how many people we are dealing with. The government is not forthcoming with any kind of statistics. And it's very difficult to know what numbers we are dealing with. But having said that, we have a major problem with street children in Iran. Estimates of between 500,000 to about 3 million street children. Judging by the figures that we hear, something like just over half of them are somehow dealing with drugs. Either they are addicted, or they're being used as mules, or somehow they're living in families that are addicted. It's very difficult to know exactly what we can do to help these children, because the government in the first instance does not acknowledge the true dimensions of the problem in Iran. We don't have a recovery center for children and youth in Iran. Two have recently been opened up in the last few weeks in one of the provinces in Sistan and Balochistan, with a capacity of 30 children. But we're talking about a possibility of tens and thousands of children throughout Iran. I know from personal contacts with Iran that NGOs that deal with drug addiction in children and youth have tried to take children into adult centers and they've been rejected. Children are picked up regularly off the street. Again, we know through the NGO network that many of them ill-treated while they're in detention, they're beaten. Last week we had a case of a 14-year-old boy whose ribs were broken while he was in custody. And, you know, things along this line. I don't want to talk for too long in case you have any other questions, but I'm happy to carry on.
Yes, but those tens of thousands of children, what's going to happen?
It's a good question. We don't know what's going to happen. Iran has a major problem with drug addiction. It's amongst the highest number of users in the world. Something like 1,350,000 Iranians are addicted to some form of opiate drug. We have a huge, over almost 2,000 kilometers border with Afghanistan, which is a major transit route of drugs into Iran. Iran deals with seizure. 74% of world opiates were seized in Iran last year, according to United Nations, and ATS drugs were also seized in Iran. But we have a huge internal consumption, and that's a major problem. And unless the authorities acknowledge the dimensions of the problems that we are dealing with, poverty, lack of education, all sorts of problems that we have. Most of the youth that we are dealing with come from families that are either one-parent families, the mother or the father is a drug addict. We have children who are born into addiction, babies that are born with addiction. Again, it is not acknowledged officially. These are all, last year, the number of women who died as a result of overdose was increased by 33% compared to the year before. Again, these are official figures, but figures are contradictory and conflicting, so it's very difficult to know exactly what kind of dimensions we're talking about. Out of the 1,350,000 Iranians who are addicts, 90% are reportedly men, 10% are women.
But why aren't these being acknowledged?
I think it's an ideological problem. Iran doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that it's dealing with this high volume. I mean, the figures that they're giving of 1,350,000, the people who are on the ground working with it estimate that to be closer to about 3 million. It's just not beneficial to admit to that kind of problem in Iran when you have a religious ideological government in position. We have something along the line of official figures of 71,000 people dealing with AIDS. Again, we know that that is much, much higher, because if you have over 1 million people who are addicts, then HIV and AIDS are very likely to be higher. The two brothers who set up Iran's first AIDS center, which received international attention and awards, ended up in prison for doing what they were doing because they had attended conferences on AIDS outside Iran, and then they were charged with espionage. So it's very difficult to understand why it's not being addressed as it should. Iran receives vast amounts of money, millions of dollars, from United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. On this, the first program was 2011 to 2014. The second 5-year program is starting this month or possibly next month. The funds will be sent to Iran. That's amongst a lot of protests. We don't want UNODC to be funding Iran because of the high number of executions in Iran. and the high number of drugs-related executions in Iran.
Well, 80% of prosecuted traffickers are given the death penalty. And is it 2 every week are executed for taking drugs, and including children? So you don't agree that about this sort of funding from the UN?
No, I disagree with it, because a lot of it is being used directly in the arrests, and the arrests then obviously lead to execution. Last year, the official figures acknowledged 753 people were executed. Over half, according to international figures, were drugs related. Last week, over a 2-day period, 43 people were executed on drugs related charges. Tomorrow, we have 9 more people who are likely to be executed. They've been transferred to solitary confinement in preparation of their execution, again on drugs-related charges. The average age of users in Iran, again according to conflicting contradictory figures, is 25 to 29. These are the young people who are born after the Islamic Revolution. So there are a lot of questions the government and the regime has to answer. And that young age is also in prison, and we have huge problems with due process, lack of due process, and the fact that drugs-related offences do not benefit from right of appeal. So when a death sentence is issued, there is no right of appeal. And death sentence can be issued for as little as 30 grams of ATS drugs, and there is no right of appeal. So we have a lot of problems to deal with. Looking at it from a human rights point of view, it's a huge tragedy and a catastrophe that we are dealing with on a daily basis.
Well, thank you so much, Roya Kashefi, for your contribution today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Dr. Fatah, do you think as Iran becomes more visible, they're going to have to do something about this?
There's no doubt about that. I think probably there are already NGOs, maybe at the grassroots. They're doing some work, but it's trivial. And Roya mentioned the Ally brothers. They were 2 brothers, providing drugs to the because the HIV affected are very common in the Iranian prisons, and they were dealing with the Iranian prisons. And Dr. Ally himself, we were in California together. We given a talk about homosexual. Give a talk about homosexual in Iran, and he was talking about HIV positive in Iran. And when he went back, he was sentenced to about 6 years imprisonment with his brother because he was, just found another crime for him.
And what happened?
He was in prison. I think he completed his sentence. Again, some of the political prisoners are also accused of drug-related cases. Of course, that's not the case. But if somebody, this is again shows how the society perceives drug addicts. When a political person accused of drug, so it's losing its social status. So it's not important anymore. And that's why probably some of those figures, the drug-related sentencing or death penalty are so high. It's like a combination of political and drug. It happens all the time.
So religion plays an important role.
Of course. And
I mean, Claire, in your experience, has religion impacted an addiction? I mean, has it curbed someone going into the addiction or maybe influenced it?
I think that it's irrespective of their religion. I think that I've worked with people who have strong religious beliefs and those who don't. I think that addiction, irrespective of race or religion, is real.
I mean, Dr. Fatah, are there authorities involved in some parts of the Middle East? Do you think they encourage drug taking?
There are reports, definitely there are reports, possibly by oppositions of Iranian opposition, stated that Iranian government encouraged drugs in some areas of Iran in order to reduce the activities of youth in the opposition.
To control them.
To control them. I mean, definitely the Kurdish groups accuse the Iranian authorities by distributing drugs almost freely in the Kurdish towns in order to control the political activities. And also other organizations, more Iranian, such as Mujahideen-i Khalq, accuse Iranian authorities by this. I mean, these are figures coming.
There's-
These are
yeah.
statements came from opposition, so I cannot verify them.
There are reports of crystal meth being available in beauticians, at the beauticians and hair salons.
That is definitely the case. You can actually go on a course that for about $70 to $100 they teach you how to produce drugs. I mean, it's interesting an observation that Iran has a very long history of drug use, unlike Iraq. It's just like, I don't know why, but probably having such a long border with Afghanistan is not very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, Claire, did you find some of the youth were too scared to come to you?
Absolutely. They were so frightened they were frightened that they would be arrested. They were frightened what their parents would say. And also they were just totally frightened that they wouldn't then be able to get a job or to get married, or indeed their siblings couldn't get married because there is such a stigma attached to being an addict.
I think nobody gives a woman to somebody who is a drug addict. I mean, even now, where I come from, the culture is changing. I come from the Kurdish region of Iraq. If somebody was like drinking alcohol, he wouldn't he couldn't marry anyone because the family say, well, he's a alcohol drinker. Stigma always attached, and it's very, very difficult to detach that stigma from all these types of drugs.
And affects the whole family.
Of course, it affects the whole family because, the culture there is not an individual culture. For example, here, I am responsible for myself. My daughters are not responsible for me, while my wife is not responsible for me. But there, if the father is misbehaved, that shames all the family, and sometimes the entire clan. For example, if somebody called a name, and the name after the family name or the surname, if you like, is a tribe name, so it shamed the entire tribe. So I mean, these cultures are still there, but of course it's changing. We are working on a moving ground, if you like.
Well, let's hope. Well, now let's move on to our next section, where we will consider the measures needed for prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation. Claire, one hears about authorities attacking the providers of drugs, whereas a lack of attention and money is actually given pumped into the medical side. Would you agree with this?
I would absolutely agree. And again, so we're focusing on the symptom, which is the drug. We're not focusing on prevention. If indeed that there can be prevention if one has a genetic predisposition. But what studies have found, certainly in the United States, if people are educated earlier, they seek treatment earlier. It doesn't mean that they don't become addicted, and I think that's a real point to consider.
Educated earlier?
I think I agree. I think it's very difficult to do that in the Middle East because, as we say, stigma attached with this. It's a taboo. But I believe for sex education, for drugs, for all sorts of other different things, the children must be taught from a very early age the danger and the risks of taking drugs, and hopefully they will be much healthier when they grow up. And it's at least in the Middle East, there's like maybe the community, the collective life does help because with all these conflicts and all these wars we see in the Middle East. People still can have a social life, and that's helpful. Maybe encouraging that social part of life would also help people to not to hook on drugs.
But often that comes from the home as well.
I mean, that is definitely true. But I guess the home needs you have to treat the family because an individual in the Middle East is not one person. You have to treat the family, and that's very, very important because if the father, if a drug addict, there's a very good chance the entire family is somehow degrading in some way or another. They are not necessarily all become drug addicts, but they are degrading in some of the social ways.
Well, we have to move on to Skype now from Vienna's Prevention, Treatment and Rehabilitation section of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is Programme Coordinator Wadi Malouf. Wadi, if we take a general look at the Middle East, which countries are of particular concern at the moment when it comes to the rise of drug drug abuse amongst youngsters?
Yeah. Hello. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your question and thank you for having UNODC on board this panel. Regarding the Middle East, I have to start by saying that the drug demand situation is not a region-specific problem. It's a global phenomenon. The Middle East is definitely not immune from this problem. The demand on drugs is purely driven by vulnerabilities, risk factors and protective factors that operate at several levels. At the individual level, mental health problems, conduct disorder, personality disorders. At the microenvironment level, variables considered at the family level, at the school level, and at the macroenvironment level, things that are on the society and the community level. For example, presence of violence, presence of crime, presence of drugs in the community, lack of legislations, lack of laws, absence of governmental infrastructure. All of these affect the vulnerability to use drugs, and drugs is not the actual result of a personally made choice, but the interaction of all of these variables. And definitely the Middle East have its own sets of vulnerabilities. Geopolitical challenges. It's a region that exists within a very heavy traffic region of all the major drug trafficking routes that exist in the world. Several countries that are in post-conflict situation, political unrest, unstable governments. All of these affect the vulnerability at several levels. And plus, there are definitely some socio-demographic characteristics. We cannot be brushed all in one stroke across the Middle East, but we can overall say that there is a generally young population, and youth are generally at higher risk of engaging in risky behavior in general, especially when compounded with the challenges that I previously mentioned. There are also different socio-demographic difficulties, lots of migrations, displacement, internal and external, unemployment. All of these vulnerability puts different countries in the region at different sort of risk, and all of them, not only within the Middle East, are not immune to it. And it's very hard to pinpoint. Of course, the higher the vulnerability, the higher the chances of youth engaging in drugs. Mm-hmm. So basically, more or less, this would give you an indication of where the focus should be. But in a nutshell, all of them are vulnerable.
And could you give us an idea of the figures involved of children used in the trade? How reliable are these? I mean, we're talking about drug trafficking and children falling into this.
Into drug trafficking. Well, actual data coming in from the Middle East regarding children being implicated in drug trafficking, the figures are not there. However, it is definitely, unfortunately, not surprising if this population is an easily exploitable situation. The same trafficking routes that are used for trafficking drugs are also used for trafficking weapons, for smuggling illegal goods in general, for human trafficking. These are more or less the same cartel that are using these routes. And definitely in any shape or form, children are and young adults are an easily exploitable population, unfortunately. Even though we don't have data, we will not be surprised in conflict regions if this situation is happening.
Wadi, at least 753 people were hanged in Iran last year, of whom more than half were drug offenders. And there have been reports that the UN Anti-Drug Agency is finalizing a multi-million-dollar funding package, including European money, for Iran's counter-narcotics trafficking programs. So despite the country's high execution rate of drug offenders, how would you respond to this?
Well, first of all, I'm not exactly familiar with the statistics mentioned, but also I have to clarify that we are the Office on Drugs and Crime. We're not an anti-drug per se, sort of an office. We're a secretariat. We're an office of the Secretariat of the United Nations specialized in drugs and crime-related issues. We do promote a health-centered and human right-based approach when it comes to drug control that address the human element when it comes to the drug problem. All the men, the women, the children affected in several ways by the problem. And we do promote a balanced approach between drug supply, and drug demand for drugs. When I say drug supply and approach, we're not only talking about controlling the availability of substances under international control, but also allowing the access for people who need it for medical purposes, that's for sure. And from a drug demand perspective, we encourage an evidence-based approach that is based on science and research. From the prevention spectrum, where we have our international standards on drug prevention, promoting not only awareness regarding drugs and the dangers related to drugs, but also addressing the vulnerability that are interrelated to several things related to crime. The same factors of vulnerability related to substance use are many times linked to crime, to violence, to other sort of, to poor scholastic achievement. And the prevention starts from infancy all the way to adulthood, and in different sectors. And from a drug treatment perspective, we promote substance use disorder approach that is dealt from a public health perspective in all spectrum of care, from early low threshold care up to treatment and rehabilitation and dealing with the negative social consequences of drug use.
But how if people are too scared to come for help or to ask for help, how much power do you have to get to the vulnerable?
Yeah, this is an important. This is linked in terms of power. If we will see, we have no power. We are governed by member states. We are at their service. And you mentioned Iran. Iran is one of the countries that is member, and it's not unlike any other country. We are involved with almost all countries, regionally and on a country-specific basis, dealing with this problem, providing technical assistance and guidance on the evidence-based, on the latest evidence-based techniques that exist. UNODC has a strong program in cooperation with Iran, as well as any other member states of the United Nations, where we continue an ongoing implementation of the conventions, building the capacity, legislation, the institutions, building, and this is how we have our set of guidelines. The International Standards on Drug Prevention, for example, is one of these guidelines, International Standard of Drug Treatment and Development, the quality standards of drug treatment. We promote nothing less but what is available for any other chronic relapsing disorder, any sort of services that science prove that is helpful for these human beings that are suffering and challenged by this disorder should be availed. And we work with member states in terms of availing that science and building their capacity to actually address this challenge and alleviate that burden from these communities.
Wadi Malouf, thanks. We have to leave you now, but thank you for being with us today.
Very much. Thank you.
Claire, I'd love to talk about your experiences in Lebanon at the Noor al-Shuruk Center and setting up a sort of treatment for individuals there. How easy was this? What were the challenges you came across?
It was incredibly difficult because in Lebanon they follow the French system, which looks at addiction as more of a social problem. Which was really difficult. So not considering, they thought it was a moral issue. People have a choice, we'll just stop using. So we worked in the community. We tried to get involved with the justice system there. So we were educating not just people in authority, but also people who we were working with who had this issue, and families too, to educate people in the community.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that Lebanon is fairly progressive.
And Noor is a very good center, probably one of the most prominent one, really.
But I mean, what about in other regions in the Middle East? Did you open sort of?
Well, this was the issue that we had, was that the reason why we opened in Lebanon was we couldn't get a license at that time for any other countries. So there was an issue even with. We couldn't get a license to open a treatment centre in other Gulf countries to help addicts. So when earlier the lady in Iran was talking about the denial in the society that children have addiction problems, for me there is still a denial, not just for the addict themselves that they have a problem, but within the family and within the larger society.
I mean, it was Ahmadinejad, the Iranian president, who said we don't have homosexuals in Iran. I mean, how could that be possible?
Is that a culture thing?
I believe
it is.
It's a religious culture. It's a taboo. You can't have homosexuals because homosexual and Muslim country should not have homosexuals. It's same as drugs. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, what's a good point, you talk about sexuality, and I said to Anna earlier was that in Lebanon, the most common operation for women is hymen replacement. So if it's not okay for a woman to lose her virginity, in order of talking about drug addiction or indeed other addictions, gambling, food, sex, there's a whole host of addictions. It's a very, very difficult subject.
And what about the difference between richer kids and poorer kids?
I think that accessibility to treatment, I would say. I heard an awful lot of talk about, various approaches from Vienna, but the practicalities on the ground is that if you do not have the funds to access treatment, despite any legislation, if it's not implemented on the ground, how can you get the support that you need? So I think the difference is perhaps you wouldn't have the crime associated with people in higher socioeconomic brackets. Indeed, in Lebanon, you would get off on a drug offence if you had money. You could buy yourself out of prison. Where if you were poor and you were caught, you'd stay there. So there's a huge difference in terms of how you're treated in society. And I think that another good point you made about it's not just about the individual, it's about working with families.
Of course.
And I think that is a huge cultural difference.
And could you?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I loved about working in Lebanon is that the family wanted to be on board. They wanted to help the person who was suffering.
But weren't we were saying earlier that actually the families are often in denial about it, and this is a stigma for them.
Absolutely. But once you got them in the door, and we talk about emotions, we explain psychoeducation around what addiction is, just like anything, once we have our awareness raised, we become more accepting. It's like, oh wow, they're not a bad person, they've got an illness.
I think most of the time the fear is the person who is drug addict in the family is rejected by the family itself in order to save the shame of the family. I think this is the same for women. If women have a relationship outside of the normal marriage, it's a problem. But if the family helping, accepting this person as an ill person and helping him, I think the drug addict could recover much faster. But it's like a vicious circle. You are really trapped. You are rejected by everybody else, and you are living in this dilemma. What do? You just use more drugs, I guess, just to forget about the world.
Okay, well, moving on. Over Skype is John Collins, coordinator of the LSE Ideas International Drug Policy Project in London. John, when it comes to drug policy in the Middle East, how effective is the international community in resolving the problem?
Not particularly effective. I think the international community over most of the last century has relied on a very prohibitionist repressive model to deal with drug use and addiction, and it just hasn't been successful, and in fact has created a lot of unintended consequences and harms. So what you're seeing at the international level is a recognition that you want to move towards a new, less repressive approach, a more public health oriented, human rights oriented approach, which deals with people where they are, deals with addiction as a public health issue, and tries to manage it in that manner, not trying to throw people in jail and destroy their lives over drug consumption, but trying to actually manage it as a health issue. I think the Middle East would certainly be seen to lag in that approach of using a public health model, but I think that's the direction of travel.
And how easy is it dealing with Middle Eastern governments to combat the drugs trade?
Well, again, it's that the Middle Eastern governments tend to take a very repressive, strict model. It is that you interdict, you eradicate, you incarcerate, and you force people into treatment. You do all these sorts of things. And so there's no sense of a kind of comprehensive public health treatment-oriented model. It's very much a repressive model. So I would say Middle Eastern governments have some catching up to do in this regard.
So it's the governments themselves that have to change things?
Yes. Look, if you're based on the premise that all the international community has to do is work harder and work closely together to tackle international trafficking and we can solve this issue, I can assure you that it will not work. And we have decades and we have virtually a century of evidence of that. The international drugs trade will persist in an illicit manner. The question is how you manage that trade. And what we've seen at a consumption level is that criminalization, prohibition, repression is not really the way to do that. The way to do it is with public health, harm reduction, ensuring that people are not picking up HIV, ensuring that people have access to treatment services and other health services, and not incarcerating them for drug consumption.
And is the consumption of drugs in the Middle East, really on the rise, or is it just that statistics are more transparent, more available now?
I think it's extremely hard to tell. I think these things go in cycles. It's very hard to know what is driving any given cycle while it's happening. Possibly you're seeing an increase in consumption, although I'd say you're probably at a peak or a plateau now in the Middle East if I was to just make an absolute guesstimate of it. But I think, yes, there is just a sense of awareness. There is sensationalist press stories which result in knee-jerk policymaking, and I would suggest a sense of step back, see what the evidence says about policy. The most attractive policy in terms of get tough and crack down and those kind of things is not the best policy in many cases. And that's what I would suggest to governments and policymakers, is to step back and see what other countries have learned from taking a less repressive model.
And what has been done from a strategic point of view when dealing with a billion-dollar culture like the drug trade? So heroin is starting in Afghanistan and traveling through Iran and Turkey.
It is a case of there's a recognition that the war on drugs has failed. It failed because it cannot work. You cannot have a war on a substance. And so then it's a case of recognizing that the war on drugs became a war on people. And so in most cases outside, say, the Middle East, in Europe, they never really pursued a war on drugs with an enormous gusto. In the United States, there's a recognition we now have the most incarcerated population in the world. A large part of that is due to the war on drugs, and it hasn't achieved what it was supposed to do. In Latin America, you see enormous levels of violence, very high levels of incarceration, human rights issues, all these sorts of things, directly attributable to the war on drugs. So it's a sense of rolling back. That's what a lot of the world is looking at, is rolling back away from this war on drugs model.
And John, are you hopeful that the war on drugs, or lack of war, but improvements can be made in the Middle East?
I think there is enormous low-hanging fruit, to use a well-worn phrase. Harm reduction services are something that we have a lot of evidence are very effective at minimizing a lot of the negative harms of drugs. HIV transmission, overdose death, ensuring access to health services. So we're talking about things like syringe exchange, opium substitution therapy like methadone, things like that. These are things with an enormous evidence base around them, are relatively cheap to implement, and save a huge amount in terms of social costs. So if you think of cases of HIV averted, for every $1 syringe exchange, some estimates put the public health savings at $27. So just by scaling up those things, no, you're not going to eradicate the drug issue. We don't know how to do that. We have no case study in how to eradicate the drug issue. We have a lot of case studies in how to manage the drug issue, and I think that's where the Middle East should be looking.
Well, thank you, John Collins, for being with us and for your expertise today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Claire, do you think if they were to legalise drugs in the Middle East, that would be beneficial?
I don't think that it would necessarily be beneficial. I think that people are going to use drugs, irrespective of policymakers, irrespective of treatment centres like myself. I think that people are going to be addicted. What I do believe, though, is that there is help available.
It might not help addiction, but it might save lives.
That's correct. And that's what's really important. And I think that part of rehabilitation, that's what that's about. It's about saving individual lives.
And Dr. Fatah, what's your take on legalisation of drugs?
I think there are, definitely some drugs should be legal. For example, beer, I don't know, some sort of alcohol. Now, if you take Iran, in some other countries, this is also forbidden. Maybe those light drugs can help people to ease out. But to go back to the Middle East, let us not forget, drugs is a business for many poor families, like in Afghanistan, especially in the Pashto region, I don't use Pashto as a ethnic group, I use a Pashto like an area, region. I mean, these families live on that.
Yes.
You really have to replace that with something beneficial. What do you do? I mean, you have to, I don't know, make people's life more prosperous in order for them to give up drugs. And there's a raft of other things which we already mentioned must go with that. For example, education, and the use of drugs properly. And if the children are aware what tramadol does to their brain, they may not use it. But now it's a small, tiny thing. You just take a couple, and you go high. It's quite fun.
Well, that's the thing. If you try and eliminate drugs, I mean, you're eliminating a lot of different industries related to this.
Of course.
And profits.
Maybe if, for example, if BA is available in some country, people don't go to taking these, heavy drugs. I don't know. There's no, but you need to educate people, and the freedom is very important. I think the expert used it, giving people freedom of move around and socialize, and you have to raise the Middle East into a more modern life, especially for the younger generation. I mean, they must have nightclubs, they must have place of enjoyment. There is currently not really much gain for the younger generation.
Final note, Claire, you wanted to intercept?
I was just thinking about the decriminalisation of drugs in general. I'm thinking to myself, is that a good idea? Is it not? And then I'm just thinking, if alcohol were invented today, if we look at in this country, in England, over 88% of arrests are alcohol related. We look at the deaths related to alcohol. So actually legalising a drug, if we look at alcohol, hasn't actually worked. It's normalised the use of it. For me, what I would like to say is, if someone is suffering with an addiction, if someone is using a chemical right now and they're watching this show and they think, I can't stop, there isn't any hope, there is hope. And the first thing is about admitting, which a lot of these governments aren't doing, that there is a problem and that there is also a solution. And it doesn't have to be put on methadone or some other harm reduction. We take you off one drug, we put you on another. Abstinence-based recovery is possible and the help is out there.
Well, thank you for that positive note to end on.
Thank you, Anna.
Well, that's unfortunately all we have time for today. As you can imagine, we've barely touched the surface of this highly complex topic. No nation is safe from illegally trafficked drugs, making this one of the most internationally prevalent topics. There's no denying that drug consumption is on the rise across all stratas of society in the Middle East, particularly the youth. The key is how to solve the problem without generating even greater violence. Of course, the issues extend beyond a quick fix. There are underlying social, economic, cultural, religious, social and political factors that need to be tackled too. But in the short term, the focus should be on protecting and treating the most vulnerable. I'd like to thank all my guests who've contributed on the programme today: Hugh Miles, Roya Kashefi, Wadi Malouf, John Collins, and of course my studio guests, Claire Vainola and Dr. Rebwa Fatah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Until next time, goodbye.